the outskirts of Albuquerque, the state of New Mexico, USA. "25 years ago, it was a small Indian village. Now it is the center in the United States for designing and manufacturing H-bombs. Maybe future generations will look back with incomprehension at those who could live in such beautiful homes and yet go off each morning to perfect weapons that may destroy civilization. Now people talk in terms of millions of deaths and the destruction of hundreds of cities. Hiroshima and Nagasaki have little meaning. At this moment, 1,000 American missiles stand by with warheads 100 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. They hum menacingly. If you touch them, they feel alive.
Sherry, would you bring me a cup of coffee, please?
Bryce Martinson is a missile commander with Strategic Air Command.
Chris, you know, we're going up to Grandma Jean's for Thanksgiving.
Every 4 days, he leaves his family to go to an underground bomb-proof command post to take charge of 10 Minuteman missiles.
I bet some more have been eating Grandpa's trees.
If necessary, he is fully prepared to take part in the destruction of whole nations and, ultimately, his family and himself.
The site that we go to, Lima Flight, is roughly 75 miles from the base. We pass also several of the missile sites which will be under our command. They're unoccupied, guarded only by the radar screen that surrounds each one.
The other missiles under his command are scattered miles apart, so that a single Russian missile could not destroy more than one of them. Martinson reaches the entrance to the command post. Once in the heavily guarded compound, Martinson and his deputy are there for 36 hours of duty. Both have been checked on by military intelligence and psychiatrists.
LCF, attention. Carry on.
Both are armed. If one of them suffers a psychiatric breakdown, it's the duty of the other to shoot him.
Thank you. Thank you.
They're required to watch one another. From now on, neither of them is allowed to be alone. Whatever they do must be done together. What does Captain Martinson's wife, Sherry, think about his job?
It really doesn't bother me that much. It's just like he's going off to his job, you know. When we first got here, maybe I thought about it more, but actually I'd rather not think about it at all.
Of course, I had to reconcile with myself, mainly because I have very firm religious convictions. And, you know, I'm not a pacifist, but yet I have a very deep faith. And so, you know, it was something I did have to reconcile, but for me to formulate all this and then come out in neat little phrases and sentences is difficult. The fact is, I've done it, and I believe I've done the right thing. What can I say?
Clear.
60 feet under the ground, Martinson and his deputy have to pass through a 7-ton steel door before reaching the entrance to the command capsule itself. They're now surrounded by thousands of tons of steel and concrete, protected from almost anything but a direct nuclear hit. A first strike by the total Russian missile forces would leave almost all of the American Minuteman missiles undamaged. If only half of them were used in retaliation, they could destroy 80% of Russian industry and 100 million people. It is this threat which would deter a Russian attack. The American second strike needn't follow an attack immediately. It could be made within minutes, days, or weeks. This would give the politicians time to decide all the facts of the enemy attack before retaliating. Before changing over, Martinson gets a report from the crew he's relieving on the state of readiness of the 10 missiles.
Well, let's see what we have. Change over. Any malfunctions on the LCP? No. All right. Change.
The red strongbox contains the secret orders to be used in case of war. Each officer secures the box with his own lock. The combination is known to him only. In the box are 2 keys. To fire the missiles, these have to be turned simultaneously in locks 30 feet apart.
This is Captain Martinson, Crew Echo 105. Changeover was accomplished at Mike 1604.
A neighboring commander in Martinson's flight can block the launching of Martinson's missiles on an automatic warning signal if both Martinson and his deputy go berserk. Thus, 4 men have to go berserk in 2 separate command posts for a missile to be launched without the president's order.
Commander, inhibit switch. To inhibit launch.
Inhibit launch.
Deputy, logic clear push button.
Not required, no lights illuminated.
NA.
The main problem for missile commanders is boredom. They've been trained to the highest peak of efficiency to carry out a task which we hope they'll never be asked to perform. In spite of this atmosphere of infallibility, 6 missiles have failed in selective tests. Once launched, these missiles cannot be recalled or even destroyed. Authorization to launch the missiles can only come from the President. His orders will be carried out from the War Room of Strategic Air Command in Omaha. It's from here that World War III will be fought. All movements within the Earth's atmosphere and beyond it in space are monitored by a network of radar stations and spy satellites. The War Room is always in voice communication with air and missile bases. When the order for war is given, it's the red telephone here which will be used. Space satellites can only give 30 minutes warning of an enemy missile launch. Over-the-horizon radars pick up the missile 15 minutes away. It's this computer which issues the orders to Bryce Martinson and the 100 other commanders. The secret tactics stored on tape are inserted in computers which transmit them to all strike forces. Within seconds, the missiles are adjusted to their targets. These tapes are brought up to date almost daily to keep up with the latest satellite information of military developments on the other side. Other computers check this automatic command system.
21st of January 1968. Fuel, Greenland. B-52 crashed, 4 H-bombs lost.
In 1960, one US admiral stated that his carrier aircraft alone had greater nuclear capability than the entire Soviet long-range bomber fleet. The American nuclear arsenal contains a horrifying variety of weapons. Air-to-ground missile developments promise to improve the effectiveness of the manned bombers. At present, each B-52 carries 3 or 4 free-fall hydrogen bombs. Soon they'll be equipped with up to 24 new standoff missiles, each with a warhead 10 times that used at Hiroshima. They can penetrate any existing defenses. An armed decoy with an electronically created radar profile similar to the bomber will lead the defense astray. Two weeks ago, the USS James Madison put to sea with 16 of the new Poseidon missiles. Each carries 10 independently targeted warheads, having more than twice the power of the Hiroshima bomb. Establishment scientists who did much of the weapons development of the 50s and 60s are becoming alarmed by these new missiles. One of their worries is the crucial question of command and control. Ex-Chief of Research at the Pentagon, Dr. Herbert York.
The position of the Navy is that we can rely on our captains to do the right thing. Now, exactly what does that mean? That's a question of some importance, but an even more important question from the point of view of us in the United States is how do the Soviets handle it in the case of their submarines? So just what is the authority of a Soviet missile submarine captain with respect to launching those weapons? People are usually willing to brush aside the question of control over our own weapons and say we can rely on our boys. But that's not really the important half of the question, because what we're relying on is their boys.
A unique Russian contribution to the game of launching a missile in as many ways as possible. A Soviet general once told a British visitor, there are optimists and pessimists in Britain. The pessimists think 5 H-bombs will wipe out everyone in Britain. The optimists think it would take 8. We have 200.
Alikiti, USSR. A tremendous explosion is reported to have blasted Soviet ICBM base. The blast was probably a nuclear explosion.
Supersonic twin-jet bombers. These are equipped with air-to-ground missiles. The increasing symmetry of the weapons systems of Russia and America suggests that Russian Air Force generals, just like American Air Force generals, get their extra planes and equipment by pointing out what the other has. The Russian Air Force started the development of the Kangaroo standoff cruise missile as soon as the Americans brought out their Hound Dog standoff cruise missile. There are a few differences. In the 50s, the Americans spent $10 billion on an air defense system. Later, the Russians spent $20 billion. But that is explained by the traditional Russian inclination to build strong defenses. Despite appearances, neither side has a system that is totally effective against the well-planned bomber attack. Nowhere has the competition in arms between Russia and America been more apparent than in the missile build-up of the 60s. Just over 10 years ago, America first installed medium-range missiles in Western Europe to threaten Russian cities. When the Russians went ahead with the world's first intercontinental rocket, the Americans assumed that their cities were now at risk. At this time, there were no spy satellites to confirm that Russia had deployed only a few. By the time American planners learned that there wasn't a missile gap, it was too late. The administration had already embarked on a huge missile-building effort. By 1963, they had 200 long-range rockets to Russia's 75. The Russians were having production difficulties. By installing short-range missiles in Cuba, they could have shortened the American lead. In the crisis that followed, the Cuban threat to America was removed. America, meanwhile, maintained an effortless superiority, easing off in 1967 with 1,054 land-based missiles and 656 in submarines. The Russians, the tortoise in this race, overtook the Americans last year in land-based rockets. Their forces include 270 of the world's largest, the SS-9. In missile-firing submarines, the Americans are still far ahead. They have 41, the Russians only 13. Each model represents 50 missiles. In the next 4 years, each will have its single warhead replaced by 3 or 10 in the case of a submarine-launched missile. No doubt the Russians too will replace their single warheads with multiple warheads. Now that we have spy satellites, each is clear about the other's capability, but knowledge about intentions is non-existent. In the Pentagon and Russian Ministry of Defense, small and select groups of professional weapons technologists have acquired immense influence on the basis of totally subjective interpretation. In the Pentagon, we spoke to the Chief of Research and Development about his fears concerning the Russian missile threat, Dr. John Foster.
This model here is a model 1/4 of an inch to the foot of the Soviet SS-9. Now, the Soviet SS-9 missile happens to be the world's largest military ICBM. You can see how large it is because, to the same scale, this is the Minuteman III missile, and this is the new Poseidon missile. Now, the purpose, as we see it, of the deployment of SS-9s is to gain the capability to attack our Minuteman fields.
But to destroy a missile in its hardened silo, accuracy is far more important than size. The incoming missile has to land within 300 yards of the silo. These Air Force surveyors are measuring the precise coordinates of a Minuteman missile. Its electronic brain must know the geographical location of the launching point and the target to a degree of precision hitherto unheard of, in order to accurately deliver the missile over its 7,000-mile range.
Well, the goal of the arms technologist is to build a weapon or a weapon system which ultimately will enable his side to win the arms race. That's an impossible goal.
For the military, science is a new toy, a pinball machine, the jackpot, an ultimate weapon. On Kwajalein Island in the Pacific, scientists are searching for the ultimate defense. They're testing high-acceleration missiles armed with nuclear warheads that are designed to intercept and destroy incoming enemy ballistic missiles. But it's like firing bullets at bullets. They're also developing revolutionary radar systems for use with 2 types of missile. The long-range Spartan is designed to intercept Russian missiles 400 miles out in space. Its nuclear warhead only needs to explode within several miles of an enemy missile to destroy it. For an H-bomb exploding in space is not what we would normally mean by an explosion. Because there's no atmosphere, there's no blast or fire, just a silent flicker of radiation. X-rays sear the thin surface of the enemy missile with intense heat and foul up the electronics. If that should fail, short-range sprints are used. These have such a high acceleration, 100 G, that they can be aimed and fired at an approaching warhead as it re-enters the atmosphere at 12,000 miles an hour. They too carry nuclear warheads and will explode only a few miles high. If they were used to defend cities, radioactive fallout from the Sprint nuclear explosion would require deep air raid shelters for the whole population, if anyone were to survive. So swift is the reaction required.
Fire and guide the Sprint.
The computers will form a network larger than the entire United States telephone system, and we know how frequently that goes wrong. A conservative estimate is that the nuclear-tipped Spartan will probably be accidentally launched once every 10 years with the danger of exploding above an American city. The Russians already have 64 anti-ballistic missiles deployed around Moscow. Professor George Rathjens, another ex-participant in the arms race.
Well, the arms race, in my view, is driven largely by both sides reacting to what the other fellow does. And both sides, the planners on both sides are very conservative people. They always assume that, they tend to assume that the other fellow's systems will work perfectly, that their own will work imperfectly, that if there's any doubt about what the other fellow will do, he will do it. So you always are reacting to your worst fears. It's a tragedy of what we've come to call worst-case analysis.
It seemed to us that the day could come when there were so many Soviet interceptors that they could easily account for all of the missiles we could send over. We had then two choices. Either we could add to our inventory of Polaris missiles and Minuteman missiles, or we could put on top of each of those types of missiles multiple warheads, so as to exhaust the interceptors on the Soviet side and still have remaining enough warheads coming in to supply destruction of population and industry and thereby maintain the deterrent.
The basis of the multiple warhead system now being deployed by the United States is the space bus. This is the part of the missile that is left coasting in space when the boosters and the streamlined nose fairings have dropped off. It's not linked to Earth for command. A computer aboard the space bus queries its instruments for velocity and orientation checks, and at the same time calls up the target information stored in its memory. Small jets allow it to direct corrective movements. At the appropriate moment, one of its several warheads is gently nudged on its course and flies free, heading towards a Russian missile complex. The bus then changes direction, checking first with the guidance unit. Reassured, the computer fires the second warhead at a city some 40 miles further east. Each movement of the space bus adds small inaccuracies, but the first warhead will land within a quarter of a mile of its target. Seconds later, the third round is directed to another city some 80 miles to the south. In the case of the Poseidon missile, up to 7 more warheads are fired. Soaring over the North Pole, the computer has instructed the space bus to release decoys. These are inflated missile shapes. In space, there's no atmosphere to slow them down, so they continue to fly on at 12,000 miles per hour. Then a TNT charge detonates, exploding the space bus into a dozen pieces to further confuse the enemy radars. Moments later, a decoy blows up, scattering fine metal chaff. This provides such a large radar reflection that the real warheads are now completely obscured. A 100 or so miles away, the first warhead, 9 feet in length, re-enters the atmosphere. The super beta shape, needle-shaped nose and flared tail has a very small radar profile. The defense may still not have seen it. It explodes several thousand feet above a city of 1 million people. Within seconds, the other warheads from the same missile are destroying other cities. This is what MIRV means.
With these kinds of developments, we may see ourselves, or we may see the Soviet Union, moving toward a doctrine of reliance on automaticity of response, reliance on radar warning to decide how to use nuclear weapons rather than deliberate decision-making. And I think all of this is a very worrisome thing. I think people are not to be trusted greatly, but machines even less.
No one's ever had to make a decision in such a decision in such a short time. Now, it could be made by a computer which has been carefully pre-programmed by data analysts, mathematicians who've thought about what to do in a completely unreal and antiseptic world the years before they worked out all these codes, when to them it was just a mathematical problem, not a problem really in the survival of civilization or not. That's one alternative, to let the machines do it. The other alternative is to somehow or other say what you're going to do is contact the president and it really is his responsibility. Well, that takes a little more time to reach the president, so some of these 5 or 10 minutes are used up in just trying to find him or get him or wake him up or whatever the situation is. And then he's supposed to decide on the basis of this complicated information whether or not to end civilization. And what's he going to do? Well, he's going to have to be pre-programmed if he's going to make this decision, so that there really isn't much choice. We're getting to a point where either we're going to use a machine to decide what to do, or else we're going to use a pre-programmed president, which isn't much of an improvement.
In a desperate effort to remove the need for a computerized response, many have urged that the land-based missiles and bombers are phased out. This would leave the submarine-based missiles, which don't depend on quick reaction. The defense planners' fears make this step unlikely.
Now, I myself think that today, the chance that the Soviets would be able to find one submarine or two are reasonable. The chances that they could find the whole force at sea, very, very small. But it would be sheer folly for a technical person in these days to say that 5 years from now, we could rest assured that the Soviets would have no way of catching all of our submarines. Sheer folly. And so we have to guard against the possibility that someday the Soviets might well be able to find, but we keep that Polaris boat secure, invulnerable. There is still the problem of assuring that once it launches its missiles, that those missiles reach their targets. What assurance do we have that in 1975, the several hundred of these missiles at sea would not be intercepted by several thousand interceptors?
Progress in the arms race, technical progress in the arms race, does not lead to greater security for either side, but continually leads to less security for each side. As time has gone on over the last 25 years, and as new weapons have been developed and introduced into the inventories of the principal participants, each time that's happened, the number of persons at risk has greatly increased, the number of lives at risk, the amount of damage that might happen to each side if nuclear exchange was to take place has always gone up after each step.
The balance of terror has put the politicians in the front line too. Because governments on both sides fear the consequences of a continuing arms race, talks are taking place to limit strategic arms. Their aim is nothing so ambitious as disarmament. That hope disappeared in the 1950s. The object of the SALT, or Strategic Arms Limitation talks, is stability in an armed world. The main destabilizing factor is multiple warheads. There's no hope that we can limit them because now the United States has completed its testing and is deploying them. They're beyond control, for unless you can unscrew the top, one missile looks like another. Since World War II, Americans and Russians have sat down 5,000 times to discuss arms limitations. Most of the proposals made by both sides have been patently designed to make the opposite side inferior or to reduce the other side's superiority. A Soviet proposal to prohibit nuclear weapons on bomber flights was aimed at the United States Air Force Strategic Air Command. At the time, the USSR had no equivalent program. A similar Soviet proposal to prohibit nuclear weapons on seaborne vessels and aircraft carriers or submarines was aimed at the US carrier forces. The United States proposed halting production of plutonium needed to make nuclear weapons. At the time, the US had far more uranium and plutonium than the Soviet Union. The Soviets proposed nuclear-free zones in Europe. The US had stationed nuclear weapons throughout NATO nations. The Soviet Union had not made analogous arrangements with its Warsaw Pact colleagues. The Russians suggested the banning of overseas military bases. The US bombers were stationed all over the world. The Soviet Union had no such advantage. The United States proposed the scrapping of medium-range bombers. They were at the time replacing their own medium-range bombers by long-range B-52s. In exchange, they would have removed 80% of the total Soviet air fleet capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Even the one major step agreed by the superpowers, the Partial Test Ban Treaty, was only taken when both sides knew they could test weapons underground. This merely turned it into an anti-pollution measure. Since 1963, there have been more weapon tests underground than there were previously in the atmosphere. In spite of the test ban, a whole range of new weapons has been developed. With the equivalent of 10 tons of TNT for each person in the world, the SALT talks could be the last opportunity to bring nuclear weapons under control.
And it seems to me that unless we can get some understanding of the purpose the end purposes that they have in mind, we'll be in a situation where we are going to have to take some actions, make some very difficult decisions, some very costly decisions, and move on our own to make certain that we do maintain a deterrent capability, that we do provide for our security.
Expensive the decision may be, but that won't make it unwelcome to American industry. A huge complex of aerospace and electronics firms has become entirely dependent on multi-billion-dollar defense contracts, and they show little inclination to use their 20th century talents for anything other than making weapons. Well over half of America's scientific manpower is devoted to military work. Behind the anonymous facade of arms factories, the pickings have been good. The Polaris program alone exceeded $13,000 million up to last year, including missiles, submarines, and support systems. Then, by producing no less than 5,000 improvements in the submarine-launched missiles in 10 years, industry puts enormous pressures on the military to keep changing their goods. Inner drives such as these, as much as Soviet behavior, decide what the US spends on nuclear weapons. Both of them have spent $600,000 million on strategic weapons alone. Some of the biggest spenders are the universities. Chief Scientific Advisor to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, now Provost of MIT, Dr. Jeremy Wiesner.
It is not right for a university to be engaged in operational weapons systems work. On the other hand, we do believe that having accepted that work in the first place, we have an obligation to not destroy that activity. Because no matter what I might think about it, it's a national resource, and the nation has to make up its mind. I can argue one way or another on these matters, but I don't feel that I have the right to make unilateral decisions for the country, and I don't believe our institution does. So that we are trying to maintain a balance here between where we think the nation should be going and what has to be done to preserve the security posture of the nation.
Dr. Wiesner feels he can't interfere, but what are the effects of this imbalance on America?
Here at home, I think the problems that we're having in our country, the unrest, the decay in our cities, the deterioration of our school systems and so on, is in a sense the compound interest that we're paying for 20 years of an arms race.
Over the past few years, students have turned more and more to demonstrating for specific objectives. At MIT, they want the guidance lab and Lincoln Radar Laboratory separated from the university. They no longer tolerate even indirect involvement with military spending.
I think, at least from my sense of what's going on now, a lot of these students no longer want to fit into the corporate image of America. They no longer want to contribute to this consumption-type society, this military-type society. And that represents a threat, a real threat to the future of America as a power which is able to, sort of take from the rest of the world and feed itself. I sort of remember in my own career when I was younger.
Brian Schwartz, a professor of physics at MIT, feels that time spent in this sort of discussion with his students is as important as talking about physics.
The issue last year was, should the university make a political stand or statement about things such as the MIRV? And people stood up in the faculty meeting and said, no, the university must not get involved politically. But then you look at all the other institutions in society, and you look at yours, and your institution has taken $50 million of this sort of research. And if you aren't going to say something about it, well, you're being a hypocrite, because you really are. You're doing the research.
The thing that's wrong with an MIT education till now is that it really never teaches a scientist to make decisions. We love going into the laboratory and taking data, and in fact, we would like nothing better than to study MIRV forever and be able to write on both sides of the issues anything that we want. But at the same time, while we're studying it, they're actually deploying MIRV right now in submarines and beginning to go on to the next project and making very high accuracy MIRVs.
The underwater missile launching system.
So here we're busy studying and talking about, do we have enough expertise and all, and then people who really don't have any more expertise than we do, in fact have probably less, go about making the decisions.
Dr. Edward Teller is probably America's most influential military scientist.
Among the young people, the opinion has spread that technology is evil, that we must do no more. People have accepted the proposition, and it is a wrong proposition. that nuclear weapons are the ultimate weapons, and only disaster can come from further pursuit of knowledge along these lines. It was always so that more knowledge will produce more power for offense, and also more power to defend oneself. Neglect of knowledge will be the end of the Western world as we know it.
10 years ago, Arthur Obermeyer used his specialized knowledge of the effects of nuclear explosives on plastics to set up his own company. He found himself swallowed up by the military-industrial complex. Even with the highest possible security clearance, he was never given information about the end product of his work. He felt he was being manipulated by a remote bureaucratic machine.
As a scientist, and even more as president of a company, I find that I have very little influence over the nature of the work that I do. I can't really justify or can't really determine whether the work that I'm doing is important or unimportant. I found that the only way I can really have some influence over the kind of work that I do is through political activity.
Hi.
Hi, honey.
Are we all set?
I think we are. We're going to have an awful lot of people here today.
Oh, great.
This is a fundraising party Obermeyer gave for a peace candidate in last November's congressional elections. Surprisingly, many of the constituents work for the multitude of defense and electronics companies around Boston.
Since we already had the constituency, a few of us decided that we ought to look for the best candidate. Rather than have the candidate look for the constituency would look for the candidate. We had a unique opportunity to find the best available candidate. I suggested the name of Father Drinan. Father Drinan is a Jesuit priest. He's been dean of the Boston College Law School for the past 15 years.
I'm honored now to present Father Robert F. Drinan, our next congressman.
2 days later, Father Drinan was elected to Congress.
This candidacy means that we are going to demilitarize this country, and we're going to have a conversion from military spending or production or defense-related industries to civilian purposes. I can think of no more pressing problem, really, in the future. When we say that $200 million every day spent on armaments is too much, everybody here, everybody in the nation would agree with that. When you spend $80 billion a year on armaments, when you spend twice as much on armaments as on education, there's something wrong with the country. And young people know particularly that something is wrong with the country. They don't want to live in an armed camp surrounded by these hideous missiles, which we will not really send even, hopefully, on a second strike capacity.
It's fine for Father Drinan to state the problem. It remains to be seen how realistic his political objectives prove to be.
And so, in some way, it seems to me, what these people are saying is, if we just hold back long enough, hard enough, surely the other side will realize that this whole business is nonsense, and they too will turn down. And I think it's a noble thought. The problem is, there are people in the United States and in the United Kingdom charged with the responsibility of seeing to it that today, tomorrow, next year, the next decade, their country will be secure. And as they look at the situation today and in the future, they come to the conclusion that there is not enough evidence to give them the necessary confidence that they can wait.
But in the fast-moving world of military technology, involving so much of the nation's economic and human resources, even slight changes of emphasis affect the lives of many people. At a recent electronics exhibition in Boston, it wasn't the usual salesmen and buyers who turned up, but unemployed PhDs, victims of the cutbacks in the US defense budget. The flow of missiles, computers and helicopters, bombs and radars has momentarily slowed. because America can't afford them. This desperate attempt at controlling inflation has brought about a personal crisis for thousands of America's most highly trained individuals.
Mr. Potter, I'm calling in reference to the advertisement you had in the Los Angeles Times for a position of quality supervisor. Yes, I have a resume. I can get it over to you, or I would like to bring it down to you and possibly talk further about the position.
There's going to be a mounting pressure for some kind of public works program to re-employ these people. And by far the simplest and most straightforward way to do it is to put them back to work at what they know how to do, which is developing military missile systems.
Yes, I bet you are getting a lot of resumes for that position now. Very good. Thank you very much then, sir. I'll see you at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Thank you very much. Bye.
Sid Tarnoff has worked for 18 years in the aerospace industries on military projects and recently the Apollo program. Before that, he had 14 years training. So far, the only offer of a job he's had in 4 months out of work is selling life insurance.
Good. Was that the only thing that looked promising? Might as well try everything.
Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe I'll mark this one out and make the phone calls there, too.
The worst they can say is no.
Okay, that's number 4 then.
Boys, this is the first atomic bomb that was ever tested. This one's called Fat Man. You saw pictures of this one being tested in the film, didn't you? So this is the first atomic weapon that was ever tested, and that was in 1945, 25 years ago. Fat Man was the end of an effort, an 18-month effort by the scientists to come up with an atomic bomb with a weaponized version of atomic energy that could end World War II. Now, this bomb wasn't the first one that used, so we'll go over and see that bomb now. And it's right over here. This bomb's called Little Boy. Boys, see how much smaller it is than Fat Man? Now, this is a different principal weapon, but it was developed and designed at the same time as Fat Man, and it was the first weapon that was used. It was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, at the end of World War II.
On September the 5th, 1945, a Daily Express reporter, the first to reach Hiroshima, wrote, "I write these facts in the hope that they will act as a warning to the world. In this first testing ground of the atomic bomb, it gives you an empty feeling in the stomach to see such man-made devastation. I could see about 3 miles of reddish rubble." 30 days after the first atomic bomb destroyed the city and shook the world, people are still dying mysteriously and horribly. All this was done by a single atomic weapon whose explosive force was equivalent to 14,000 tons of TNT.
All right, here we are. This is the Mark 17, boys. This is the first H-bomb. You can see it's much bigger than the other bombs, and it has a much higher yield. The yield of this bomb is compared or comparable to megatons of TNT, or millions of tons of TNT, where the ones that we've, yes. Megaton means 1,000,000 tons of TNT.
Nuclear weapons come in small sizes too, handy for the battlefield if you're in the army, or the suitcase if you're an urban guerrilla. There are over 7,000 of these in Europe alone. Few are less destructive than Little Boy or Fat Man. Paradoxically, nuclear weapons are not expensive. As the Americans say, bang per buck, they're cheap. Any nation with its own nuclear power station could make one. It would be crude compared with these, but it could work. Nations on the short list to have them by 1975, apart from the USA, USSR, Britain, China and France, who already have them, are India, Japan, Italy, Sweden, South Africa, Israel, Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Canada, Netherlands, West Germany, Switzerland.
We refer to this as the Mark 28 family because all 4 of these bombs are the Mark 28. The center section of each bomb is the same, but the noses and the tails are different for different purposes.
What's the difference when it's real fat and one's real skinny?
Well, remember the first ones that we saw were very fat, and then the scientists work at trying to make them smaller and smaller. They work at trying to miniaturize many of the components, and so they make them smaller for that reason. Well, do you think they're trying to make them smaller So just so they'll be easier to carry, or do you think they're trying to make smaller yield weapons? Do you think they'll try and make bigger yield weapons?
Well, I think they're trying to make the weapons smaller in the size and let's see, a little bigger in the yield.
And bigger in the yield. You think we'll keep on making bigger and bigger weapons then?
Well, I think we'll have them bigger in the yield, but not in the size.
Do you think we should go on making bombs like this? Do you think we should, that men should spend their time making bombs which can blow up whole cities? Do you think that's a good thing to do?
Well, not really, but in some cases it's important.
I believe what he's trying to say is that the free world should certainly maintain a deterrent against aggression, and any nation that would try to fool around with the United States or the free world should certainly realize that we won't be taking a back seat.
What do you think about the use of these bombs, boys? Do you think we should ever use them, just keep them and not use them?
Well, not really.
Not really? What do you think? Go ahead.
Well, I think that if there is, it will be a miracle, but I don't think that there will be, because there is meant to be wars, even though they are very unpleasant, but there is meant to be wars. And I don't think that the atom bomb should have ever been
I believe that's the boys' religious training coming out, because in the Bible it says there will be wars and rumors of wars.
Do all of you agree that there will always be wars, or do you think we'll ever have a time where we can get rid of bombs?
If they did plan an attack, we'd probably try to make peace with them as usual, but we also have a chance of using them as not but that. After we make peace, we could explode them in the ocean.
Oh, you think we could get rid of them?
Our maps of how to make them and whatnot. Also, if we get together, there's another reason why we can get together, to straighten up the mess that's already started, pollution and whatnot like that.
We've got a lot of good topics, huh, for us to get around the table on already. You think we might be able to do that?
Yes.
Then do you think we could get rid of our nuclear weapons?
Well, yes, I do believe so.
Where will it end? Only in the Antarctic, outer space, and on the seabed have we declared a halt to this madness. These are environments in which the military have no interest. We live in a dangerous world. We must find a way to halt the race to oblivion and banish nuclear weapons from this planet before it becomes a speck of ash.
A possibility is that we may have to learn the lesson again of the dangers of nuclear weapons by having one or two used. That would certainly be preferable. I hope it won't happen, but it would be preferable to having this all-out exchange. If it ever does happen, if we use one or two again, one or two more large cities destroyed, I would think that that would really change the climate for negotiations.
The kind of world this will leave future generations is probably beyond the calculation of any armchair strategist, who in any case won't have to live with it as these American scouts will. If we cannot stop this nuclear madness now, we may be dooming mankind to early extinction.
I think one's talking about certainly hundreds of cities annihilated, whole areas destroyed from the point of view of agriculture and ecology. But one's not talking about the peoples of this earth disappearing.